On June 19, 2026, the Pentagon spokesman stood at the podium and said, quoting directly from the official Department of Defense press briefing transcript, that the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, operating in the Eastern Mediterranean, represents, quote, an unambiguous demonstration of American power projection capability and a decisive deterrent to any adversary contemplating escalation. Hold on to those 4 words: unambiguous, decisive, deterrent. Because on that same day, according to reporting by Breaking Defense and confirmed by satellite imagery analysis published by the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, Iran conducted a 4-hour live-fire exercise in the Strait of Hormuz, involving coordinated salvos from shore-based anti-ship missile batteries, fast-attack boat swarms operating below the radar horizon, and subsurface drone platforms approaching a simulated carrier-sized target from beneath the surface. All 3 attack vectors were fired simultaneously against a single simulated target. The exercise lasted 4 hours. According to the post-exercise assessment published by the Middlebury Institute, the simulated carrier target was struck repeatedly by assets operating simultaneously from directions and altitudes that no single defensive battery can cover at the same time. These 2 things cannot coexist in the same strategic reality. Either the carrier strike group is the decisive deterrent the Pentagon claims it to be, or Iran just spent 4 hours demonstrating in a publicly observable exercise using real equipment in real water that the deterrence calculation has fundamentally changed. Today, I'm going to show you which one reflects the actual operational picture, and why the gap between the public statement and the operational reality may be the single most consequential strategic blind spot in the entire theater. Right now, CNN, the BBC, Fox News, Sky News, and every major foreign policy publication is asking one question: will the United States use its carrier strike group to strike Iran? That is the wrong question. The wrong question entirely. It treats the carrier strike group as the dominant variable in the equation, the thing whose use or non-use decides all outcomes. It frames Washington as the actor with the initiative, and Tehran as the reactor responding to American choices. It assumes the carrier is what it appears to be. The right question is this: at what precise moment did the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group transition from being Iran's primary fear to being Iran's primary strategic asset? And does anyone inside the decision-making chain in Washington fully understand that the transition has already occurred and cannot be reversed by a press statement? In the next 20 minutes, I am going to teach you the framework I call the liability inversion, explain the specific technical and political mechanics by which a military asset designed for power projection can be systematically converted by an adversary's actions into an operational constraint on the very power it was meant to project, walk you through 5 documented capability developments that confirm Iran has completed this inversion against the Gerald R. Ford, address the strongest, honest counterargument that exists in the literature, and then identify the actor who benefits most from this transition without having invested a single dollar in making it happen. The liability inversion framework begins with a deceptively simple observation that has enormous and underappreciated implications. The value of any military asset is not a fixed property of the asset itself. It is a dynamic ratio. The ratio of what the asset can credibly threaten to what it costs to protect it in a specific operational environment against a specific adversary. When that ratio is highly favorable, when the asset threatens far more than it costs to protect, it functions as a genuine deterrent. When the cost of protecting the asset begins to approach or exceed the military value of the threat it projects, the asset has crossed what I call the inversion threshold. At that point, it is no longer primarily weapon. It is primarily a target. And a target that an adversary knows you cannot afford to lose is not a deterrent at all. It is a leash. It constrains your own behavior. It is a constraint on your freedom of action dressed in the visual costume of military power. Think about the chess grandmaster and the novice. The grandmaster's queen is the most powerful piece on the board by a significant margin. It can move in every direction, threaten multiple pieces simultaneously, and end games through combinations that the novice cannot anticipate. But if the novice, through patient and counterintuitive maneuvering, manages to create a board position where moving the queen exposes the king to check, The queen does not disappear from the board. It is still physically there. It still controls the squares it controls. It is still technically the most powerful piece, but it cannot move. Its mobility, which is the entire source of its power, has been neutralized not by destroying it, but by constructing a situation in which using it produces an outcome worse than not using it. Iran does not need to sink the Gerald R. Ford to win this strategic contest. It needs to make the political and operational cost of using the Gerald R. Ford exceed the strategic benefit of deploying it offensively. That is the liability inversion. And Iran has been engineering it methodically and patiently for years. The historical anchor for this framework is the 1982 Falklands War, and the analogy is precise enough to be worth taking seriously. Argentina did not possess a navy remotely comparable to the British Royal Navy in tonnage, technology, training, or experience. What Argentina possessed was a single squadron of super étendard attack aircraft armed with Exocet anti-ship missiles. Those missiles cost approximately $200,000 each in contemporary equivalent terms. The HMS Sheffield, the Royal Navy, Type 42 destroyer they sank on May 4th, 1982, represented a procurement cost equivalent to approximately $200 million and embodied years of British naval design, engineering, and trained personnel. One $200,000 missile, one $200 million ship, gone in seconds. The cost-exchange ratio was 1,000 to 1 in Argentina's favor. But the truly decisive impact was not the financial loss. The documented and historical effect on British task force commanders was immediate, concrete, and qualitative. Decision makers who had been operating with broad operational latitude suddenly began explicitly calculating exposure, corridors, risk profiles, and the political cost of losing another capital ship to a weapon they could not reliably detect or intercept. The Exocet did not defeat the British Navy in the conventional sense. It changed the cognitive architecture within which British commanders made every subsequent decision about using that navy. It introduced documented hesitation into a command structure that had been operating with professional confidence. And in military strategy, hesitation at the command decision level is not a minor inconvenience. It is the beginning of strategic paralysis. Now let us look at the evidence. There are 5 specific capability developments, all documented and publicly attributed, that when examined together demonstrate that Iran has completed the liability inversion against the Gerald R. Ford strike group. 5, not 2, not 3. 5 distinct and observable components of a single, coherent strategic achievement. Number 1, the missile cost asymmetry. Iran's primary anti-ship missile, the Noor, is an Iranian domestically produced and locally modified derivative of the Chinese C-802 design, with performance improvements incorporated over approximately a decade of Iranian development work. Its estimated unit procurement cost falls between $300,000 and $500,000. The Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier itself represents a shipbuilding cost of approximately $13 billion, with a total program cost, including aircraft procurement, integrated weapon systems, and support infrastructure, approaching $20 billion. That raw cost comparison is meaningful, but not the decisive number. The decisive number is the cost exchange in a live defensive engagement. The carrier group's primary missile defense system, the Aegis combat system, paired with SM-6 interceptor missiles, costs approximately $4 million per interceptor round, actually expended in an engagement. The cost exchange in a defensive scenario therefore looks like this. Iran fires one $300,000 Noor missile. The carrier group must spend approximately $4 million in interceptor capability to defeat it. Iran fires a coordinated salvo of 30 missiles simultaneously. The carrier group must expend potentially $120 million in interceptors in a single engagement, and Iran retains more missiles than it expended. $300,000 against $4 million. Not a marginal asymmetry that technology can close. A structural asymmetry that is built into the physics of the cost ratio between a relatively simple offense and a highly sophisticated defense. No upgrade to the Aegis system changes this fundamental economic reality. The economics of the exchange are permanently and structurally in Iran's favor. Number 2, the saturation architecture. The June 2026 Hormuz exercise was not designed as a test of whether a single Iranian missile can penetrate a carrier's point defense in isolation. That is a well-understood and already answered question. The exercise was specifically designed to test coordinated tri-vector saturation from 3 simultaneous approach geometries: shore-based ballistic missiles with terminal phase maneuvering capability, approaching from elevation on one vector, sea-skimming cruise missiles launched from fast attack boats operating below the radar horizon, approaching horizontally from a second vector, and subsurface drone platforms approaching from beneath the carrier group's surface scanning radar coverage envelope on a third vector. All 3 firing simultaneously against a single simulated target. The purpose of tri-vector saturation is not to maximize the probability that every weapon in the salvo reaches its target. The purpose is to force the carrier group's integrated air and missile defense systems to simultaneously process incoming threat tracks from 3 geometrically distinct approach angles, 3 different altitude profiles, 3 different radar cross-section signatures, and 3 different terminal approach speeds at the exact same moment. That simultaneous multi-vector processing demand creates genuine calculation delays as the engagement computers prioritize targets, creates genuine coverage gaps at the geometric intersections between the individual defensive batteries' engagement envelopes, and creates genuine decision latency at the command level that did not exist when the threat was single vector. Think of it this way. You are a goalkeeper, standing in the center of a standard goal. 3 penalty kicks are struck simultaneously. 1 to the upper left corner, 1 to the lower right corner, and 1 at waist height straight down the center. You are physically capable of reaching any one of those 3 shots independently. You cannot reach all 3 simultaneously. One gets through. The question is only which one. Iran does not need all 30 missiles in a salvo to penetrate the carrier group's defenses. It needs 1. Against a tri-vector saturation attack of sufficient scale, analysts at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments have assessed in published work that the probability of at least 1 penetration reaches a level that must be factored into operational planning. That assessment changes the entire risk calculus. Number 3, the standoff range compression. The Gerald R. Ford's primary strike aircraft, the F/A-18 Super Hornet, carries a combat radius of approximately 700 nautical miles with a standard strike weapons load operating from the carrier's flight deck. Iran's shore-based Khalij Fars anti-ship ballistic missile system has a publicly documented maximum range of approximately 300 kilometers, roughly 160 nautical miles from the Iranian coastline. This creates a hard geometric constraint on carrier positioning. The carrier must maintain a standoff of at least 300 kilometers from the Iranian coastline to minimize its direct exposure to the Khalij Fars threat. But its aircraft must fly from that standoff position inward through the contested corridor toward targets inside Iran to conduct meaningful strikes. That corridor between where the carrier must stay and where its aircraft must go is precisely the space Iran has populated with layered air defense systems, tanker-killing long-range drone platforms, and electronic warfare assets that have been specifically designed, positioned, and exercised to operate against aircraft transiting that exact approach geometry. The carrier is being progressively pushed back from the coastline, not in a single dramatic step that would generate headlines. Incrementally, each additional Iranian capability development extends the effective exclusion zone by another operational increment. Each increment of additional standoff distance reduces the effective strike radius of the carrier air wing by a compounding amount. The erosion does not appear in any Pentagon press briefing as a catastrophic capability loss. It accumulates quietly, year over year, as a structural degradation in what the carrier can credibly threaten from a safe operating position. Number 4, the political threshold dynamics. This is the dimension that receives almost no analytical attention in mainstream coverage, and that may be the most operationally significant factor of all. The Gerald R. Ford carries approximately 5,000 sailors, officers, aviators, and aircrew. It carries approximately 75 aircraft, representing some of the most advanced military aviation technology currently fielded. It is, in the most direct sense, the physical and symbolic embodiment of American naval supremacy, American capacity for global power projection, and American credibility in its commitments to allies in the region. psychologically, politically, symbolically, and in terms of its cascading effects on global allied confidence in American extended deterrence. It is irreplaceable within any short-term or medium-term operational window. If the Gerald R. Ford were seriously damaged in an exchange with Iran, not sunk, not destroyed, but seriously damaged with significant casualties and visible evidence of hull penetration, the domestic American political consequences for any sitting administration would be severe and potentially unmanageable. Congressional investigations, market reactions, cascading allied confidence questions across Europe and the Pacific simultaneously, strategic recalculation by every country that currently relies on American security guarantees as the foundation of its defense posture. Iran understands this political cost calculation in specific and studied detail. American strategists also understand it, which means that every operational decision to use the carrier strike group offensively against Iranian targets is now evaluated against a background level of political catastrophe risk that did not exist at the same magnitude 15 years ago. The carrier can still technically execute its mission. Its aircraft can still physically reach their targets. But every decision to order it to do so now passes through a political cost-benefit filter involving a magnitude of downside risk that makes it functionally a last resort option rather than a flexible power projection tool. That is not deterrence functioning as designed. That is a profound constraint on American decision-making, wearing the visual appearance of deterrence. Number 5, the documented exercise progression. This is the most direct, most observable, and most falsifiable evidence in the entire analytical chain. According to analysis published by the United States Naval Institute in 2025 and updated in early 2026, Iran has conducted no fewer than 14 major naval exercises specifically designed to simulate anti-carrier strike operations over a 3-year period. 14 documented exercises. Each one has been monitored by American intelligence collection assets in the region. Each one's observable elements have been incorporated into subsequent updates to Iranian naval operational doctrine. The progression across those 14 exercises follows a systematic developmental arc. The early exercises tested single-vector anti-ship attacks using shore-based missiles alone. Subsequent exercises incorporated a second vector, adding fast-attack boat swarms, launching sea-skimming cruise missiles at low altitude. The most recent exercises, culminating in the June 2026 event, observed by the Middlebury Institute, incorporated the third vector of subsurface drone platforms, attacking from below the carrier group's surface radar coverage. This is a systematic, deliberate, 14-step iterative capability development sequence directed at one specific target type, in one specific body of water, at specific engagement ranges that correspond to the Gerald R. Ford's actual current and historical operating positions in the region. Iran is not practicing generic anti-ship warfare. It is running a targeting curriculum against a named vessel class. Now I want to give you the strongest, honest counter-argument, because you deserve the complete intellectual picture, and because this argument has genuine force. Because our sure the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group does not operate as an isolated platform, exposed to attack without any defensive support. It operates as a fully integrated battle group that includes Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers with their own independent Aegis combat systems, multiple Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, providing additional layered defense, a submarine component that no Iranian exercise can realistically replicate in simulation because its capabilities and positioning are classified, and an air wing that includes EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft specifically designed to suppress, deceive, and degrade precisely the the kind of radar guidance systems that Iran uses to target its anti-ship missiles. The conclusion that Iranian exercises against a simulated carrier prove operational effectiveness against the full integrated carrier strike group commits a fundamental modeling error. Furthermore, the primary deterrence function of the carrier's presence does not require its actual use. A carrier positioned in the eastern Mediterranean shapes Iranian planning, constrains Iranian options, and consumes Iranian military attention and resources, even without firing a single weapon. That is deterrence functioning as designed. This is a serious argument grounded in genuine strategic logic and operational experience. But here is what that argument cannot explain. It cannot explain why the United States Navy has not published a single public technical assessment concluding that the specific tri-vector saturation architecture demonstrated in the June 2026 exercise has been operationally defeated by the existing carrier strike group defensive configuration. When you have assessed a threat and found it manageable within your current systems, you say so. The institutional incentive for the Navy to publicly reassure allies and deter adversaries by publishing such an assessment is high. The absence of that assessment is not an oversight. It cannot explain why the carrier is currently operating in the eastern Mediterranean rather than inside the Persian Gulf, which would represent a more forward and more credible deterrent position relative to Iran. Someone has already made the force protection judgment that inside Gulf positioning is operationally unacceptable. That judgment was made without announcement, and it cannot explain why 14 consecutive exercises have each added a new capability layer without producing a single American public statement explaining in specific technical terms how each new capability has been evaluated and found to be within the carrier group's existing defeat envelope. When the answer is reassuring, you provide it. Silence in the face of a documented capability progression is not confidence. It is concern that has no safe public expression. Let me bring this all together. The liability inversion is not a future risk requiring mitigation. It has already occurred. The Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group crossed the inversion threshold at the precise moment when the political cost of losing it exceeded the military value of using it, and when the technical cost of defending it created a structural economic asymmetry that permanently favors the attacker. Iran achieved this not by constructing a navy capable of defeating the American carrier group in open combat, but by building a specific, narrow, cost-asymmetric targeting architecture optimized entirely for one mission, making the use of a carrier against Iran prohibitively expensive and making its defense financially unsustainable in a sustained exchange. The 5 components we examined, the missile cost asymmetry, the saturation architecture, the standoff range compression, the political threshold dynamics, and the 14 exercise targeting curriculum are not 5 separate and independent problems. They are 5 analytically distinct faces of a single coherent strategic achievement. Iran has converted America's most powerful, forward-deployed naval asset into a symbol that cannot be used without risking everything that gives the symbol its meaning. And now the actor that nobody in this conversation is naming. Not Iran, not the United States, China. China operates the world's largest navy by hull count and has spent approximately a decade building and refining its own anti-access and area denial doctrine, which is specifically designed to defeat American carrier strike groups operating in the Western Pacific in a potential Taiwan contingency scenario. Every time Iran successfully demonstrates a cost-asymmetric, saturation-based anti-ship capability in the Persian Gulf under observable conditions, it provides China with a real-world, externally conducted, operationally genuine validation of the strategic concepts China has been developing primarily through simulation and theoretical modeling. China does not fund the Iranian exercises. It does not need to. Iran is running the experiment for free in a live operational environment against American defensive systems operating at their actual readiness levels, in a theater where both American capabilities and American decision-making dynamics can be directly observed. If Iran's approach demonstrates that the liability inversion is operationally durable, China takes that confirmed lesson, scales it to Pacific operational dimensions, and the United States discovers that the carrier strike group, the centerpiece of American power, projection doctrine, for 80 years, has been structurally obsoleted in pure competitor environments by an adversary that never once needed to engage it in direct combat. The patient giant reads the board, does not fire a missile, and builds the next exam accordingly. 3 things to watch in the next 48 to 72 hours. First, watch whether the Gerald R. Ford's operating coordinates shift. a movement of more than 50 nautical miles further from the Iranian coastline over the next 72 hours, is not routine repositioning for operational variety. It is a force protection adjustment made in direct response to the post-exercise assessment data produced by the June 19th Hormuz exercise.